Sarah Miller had lived on the same patch of land her entire life. Her father had built a ranch from nothing, just a dream and a few head of cattle back in the day. Over the years, it became more than a place to live. It became the heart of who she was. But now, everything was unraveling. The drought had been relentless. For months, there hadn't been a drop of decent rain. The once lush fields had turned to brittle dust, and the creek that ran behind the barn bed had dried up completely. Grass that once grew thick and green now crunched under her boots like fallen leaves. 3 of her horses had already been sold to cover the mounting bills, and the 5 that remained were growing thinner by the day. Sarah had held on for as long as she could, rationing feed, skipping meals, scraping together every last cent. But she was out of time. The final $2,000 she had saved sat in a worn envelope on her kitchen table, carefully counted and laid out like a fragile lifeline. It wasn't just money. It was the last thread holding her father's dream together. Enough for one final delivery of hay. Enough to keep the animals going just a little bit longer, maybe until a miracle came. But deep down, Sarah wasn't sure she believed in miracles anymore. As she stared at the bills, the weight of the decision settled heavily on her shoulders. Her hands were calloused and cracked from long days in the sun, her body exhausted from early mornings and late nights, trying to keep the ranch alive. She hadn't paid herself in months. The cupboards were nearly bare. Her truck was on its last legs. Yet she kept going, not for comfort, but for honor, for the memory of her father who had once stood tall on this land and believed that anything was possible with hard work and heart. Outside, the dry wind swept across the open fields, carrying dust and silence. Sarah looked out the window at the weathered red barn and the sloped roof of the old horse stable. Her eyes drifted to the photo of her father hanging near the back door, his smile captured in a frame, his cowboy hat tilted just slightly. "I'm trying, Daddy," she whispered. "I really am." There was no one left to turn to, no family to call, no miracle loan or last-minute rescue. Just her, the land, and the quiet hum of survival. She tucked the envelope into her jacket pocket and grabbed her keys. She needed to clear her head. Maybe a drive to town, a quick cup of coffee, and the familiar comfort of the local diner would help her figure out what came next. Little did Sarah know the decision she was about to make, one born from selflessness, not strategy, would set in motion a chain of events more incredible than anything she could imagine. Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness echo far beyond the moment they're given and change lives in ways no one sees coming. The bell above the door chimed softly as Sarah stepped into the diner. The scent of brewed coffee and yesterday's bacon still lingered in the air. It was the kind of small-town place where everyone knew your name, but today, Sarah hoped to go unnoticed. Her boots scraped quietly against the worn tile floor as she made her way to the counter. Maggie, the owner, greeted her with a warm, if slightly concerned smile. "Morning, Sarah." "The usual. Just coffee today," Sarah replied, her voice a little tired, her smile a little forced. She settled onto a stool near the end of the counter, wrapping her hands around the warm mug Maggie placed in front of her. The steam curled into the air, comforting in a way. Sarah stared into the dark liquid, trying not to think about the envelope in her pocket or the hungry eyes of her horses back at the ranch. Then the door chimed again. A man stepped inside, moving slowly. He wore faded jeans, a flannel shirt, and a military cap that had seen better days. His shoulders slumped beneath an invisible weight, and as he eased himself onto a stool 2 seats away from Sarah, she noticed how he favored one leg, shifting with discomfort. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the menu, though he barely looked at it. "Coffee. Black," he said, his voice quiet, rough. Maggie brought the cup and gave him a gentle nod. "How's the job search going, Tom?" He gave a tight, humorless smile. "Not great. Got turned down at the warehouse yesterday. Said the leg was a liability." Sarah caught the way he leaned more heavily against the counter, taking pressure off his right side. She'd seen the kind of pain before, the kind that didn't go away with rest. Her cousin had come home from Afghanistan with the same look in his eyes, the same silent battles brewing just beneath the surface. Maggie hesitated before asking, "And the apartment?" Tom's shoulders dropped even lower. "We got the eviction notice yesterday. 3 days to come up with $2,000, or we're out." He paused, staring down into his cup. "Leah's trying to pick up extra shifts at the hospital. The baby's been sick, though. She's already stretched thin." His voice cracked just a little, enough to betray how close he was to breaking. Sarah sat very still, his words echoing in her head. $2,000, the exact amount in her jacket pocket. She glanced down, her heart pounding. That money was meant for her animals. Without it, there would be no feed, no hope, no future for the ranch her father had built from sweat and grit. But Tom wasn't asking for pity. He hadn't even asked for help. He was just a man, tired, hurting, desperate. Not for himself, but for his family. She turned toward him. "You served?" she asked gently. He looked over, surprised someone was speaking to him. He nodded. "Yeah, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. My cousin was in Afghanistan too. 10th Mountain Division." Something softened in his face. "Good unit." Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the edge of her coffee cup. The money in her pocket weighed heavier now, not in cash but in choice. She thought of her father's favorite mare, thin from weeks of rationing. She thought of the dusty pastures, the empty feed bins. But then she imagined a sick baby being packed up into a car because there was nowhere else to go. A young mother exhausted from work and worry. A man who had risked everything for his country, now facing homelessness in silence. "I think I might be able to help," she said suddenly. Tom blinked. "Help." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the envelope. Her hands didn't shake, though her stomach turned with fear. She placed it gently on the counter between them. "There's $2,000 in there," she said. "It was meant for feed, but you need it more." Tom stared at the envelope, then at her. His face paled. "Ma'am, I can't take your money. We don't even know each other." "You serve our country," she said. "My daddy always said we owe veterans more than we can ever repay. So take it. Keep your family in your home." He shook his head, visibly overwhelmed. "That's your money. You must need it for something important." "I do," she admitted. "But I'll figure something out. I always do." Maggie, watching from behind the counter, frowned with concern. "Sarah, are you sure? What about your ranch?" Sarah didn't look away from Tom. "They're just animals," she said softly. "I love them, but I can find a way. He's got a baby." Tom's eyes filled with tears. He reached for the envelope with trembling hands. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she replied. "Just promise me you'll get back on your feet." "I'll pay you back," he said, voice steadying. "Every penny. I swear it." "No rush," she smiled. "Take care of your family first." He stood a little taller this time and held out his hand. "Tom Wilson, Sarah Miller." Their hands met, calloused, worn, honest. A handshake born not of transaction, but of something far more sacred, human decency. As Tom tucked the envelope into his jacket and walked out of the diner, Sarah sat back down. Maggie poured her another cup of coffee in silence. The air felt heavy, but something had shifted. "That was your feed money, wasn't it?" Maggie asked quietly. Sarah nodded, staring out the window. "Yeah, the horses will be hungry by tomorrow night." "What are you going to do?" Sarah looked down at her hands, then out toward the road where Tom had disappeared. "I don't know," she said softly, "but I couldn't let him lose everything. I just couldn't." And in that moment, she didn't realize it yet, but she had just planted the first seed of a miracle. The drive home was quiet. Too quiet. Sarah's old pickup rattled down the dusty road, the setting sun casting long shadows across the dry fields. Her hand stayed tight on the wheel, though her mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying the scene at the diner over and over again. She had handed over every last cent she had left. No backup plan, no secret stash, just a silent prayer that somehow, some way, she'd figure it out. As she pulled up to the barn, the horses greeted her with soft whinnies and expectant eyes. They had no idea the feed was nearly gone, that their future, like hers, now hung by the thinnest thread. She climbed out of the truck and walked slowly to the feed room. There, in a nearly empty bin, were the final handfuls of hay and grain. Sarah portioned it carefully, just enough to quiet the hunger in their bellies, but nowhere near what they needed. As she scooped the last flakes into their stalls, She whispered quiet apologies to each of them. "I'm sorry, Belle. I'm doing the best I can." Her father's favorite mare nudged her shoulder gently, as if sensing the weight Sarah carried. She ran a hand down the horse's neck, her throat tightening. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She had worked so hard to keep the ranch alive, to hold on to something that mattered. And now, all of it was slipping away. She made her way back to the porch, the air cooling fast as dusk settled in. The silence stretched out, interrupted only by the distant rustling of the wind in the brittle grass. Sarah sat on the top step, her phone in her lap, and started dialing. She called every rancher she knew, every old friend, every supplier. The conversations were all the same. Too many mouths to feed, too little hay to go around. The drought had taken a toll on everyone, and no one had anything to spare. "Sorry, Sarah," one man said. "If I had even one extra bale, I'd send it your way. But I've got nothing left myself." Another voice. "I wish I could help, but we just sold off half our stock to stay afloat." As the hours dragged on, so did the weight on her chest. Her voice grew hoarse, her list of names shorter. By the time midnight rolled around, the only sound in the house was the soft tick of the kitchen clock and the quiet, constant ring of hope fading with each unanswered call. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar creaks of the old house around her. She thought about her father, about the summers they spent fixing fences and feeding foals. She remembered him saying once, "This land will test you, girl, but if you give it your heart, it'll give you a purpose." Right now, it felt like the land had taken everything and given nothing back. When morning finally came, it wasn't the light that woke her, it was the horses. Their anxious whinnies carried through the open window like distant cries for help. They were hungry, and they were waiting for her. Sarah got up, heavy with the knowledge that there was nothing left to give. She pulled on her boots slowly, laced up her jeans, and walked out to the barn. The moment she opened the doors, the horses turned toward her, pressing their heads over the stall gates, ears pricked with anticipation. But all she had was a small pail of leftover grain, barely enough to divide between them. She moved down the row, whispering to each one, offering a gentle stroke or a quiet word. The sound of them chewing echoed in the silence of the barn. It was a sound she'd always loved, familiar, grounding, but today it felt like a farewell. As she stepped back and looked around at the empty feed room, the worn tack hanging from its hooks, the dust catching in the morning light, Sarah realized that this might be the last day she ever stood in this barn as its owner. The last time she'd care for the animals her father once called his pride and joy. Her chest ached. She turned toward the open doors, the sun rising slowly over the dry horizon, and whispered aloud to no one, "What have I done?" But even as the fear and regret threatened to overtake her, somewhere deep down, something still flickered, a quiet voice, the echo of her father's steady hand on her shoulder. "You did the right thing." Sarah stood there for a long moment, unsure of what came next. She had no answers, no guarantees, just the remains of a choice she'd made in a quiet diner the day before. A choice that, unknown to her, was already rippling out into something far bigger than she could ever imagine. The next morning began like any other, quiet, still, and heavy with the weight of uncertainty. Sarah stirred in bed, her body stiff from a sleepless night. The early light filtered in through the thin curtains, casting a pale gold glow across the wooden floor. Somewhere outside, the horses stirred again, calling for a breakfast that wasn't coming. She knew today would bring hard choices, calls to buyers, a goodbye to the animals that had been her life. But before she could even pull on her boots, a strange sound cut through the morning air. Engines, big ones, the low, steady hum of diesel trucks on gravel. She froze. No one came down her road, not unless they were lost or had a reason. She stepped out onto the porch, shielding her eyes from the sun with one hand. What she saw made her heart skip. 3 large military trucks were parked across her driveway, effectively blocking the only exit off her property. Dust still hovered in the air around them. Uniformed men stepped out, moving with precision. Radios crackled, boots crunched on the gravel, and for a long moment, Sarah just stood there, unsure whether she was witnessing a mistake or something far more serious. A tall man in a decorated uniform approached. He had a commanding presence, crisp and composed, like someone used to giving orders and having them followed. "Are you Sarah Miller?" he asked. "I am," she said slowly, cautious. "What's going on? Who are you?" "I'm Colonel James Parker," he said. "We're looking for some land to use for a training exercise. Local terrain familiarization for a few of our units. We were told your property might be suitable." Sarah blinked. "My ranch? This place?" The colonel nodded. "We're looking for something quiet, rural, out of the way, but still accessible. Your property checks all those boxes." She couldn't hide her confusion. "But how did you even find me? Who told you about this place?" The colonel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notepad. He flipped to a page, glanced at it, then met her eyes. A man named Tom Wilson. At the sound of that name, Sarah's breath caught. "Tom? From the diner?" The colonel gave a small smile. "Yes. He mentioned your ranch. Said you might be open to helping us out." Sarah didn't know what to say. Her mind reeled with questions. Yesterday, Tom had barely been able to stand without wincing. He'd been exhausted, broke, worried, sick over his family. And now she was hearing that he had connections to military operations? I don't understand," she said honestly. The colonel offered her a folder. "We're prepared to offer $5,000 for a 3-day lease. We won't disturb your operations. Our team is self-sufficient. We just need space to run some basic communication and setup drills." $5,000. The number hit her like a jolt. That was more than double what she'd given Tom. More than enough to buy feed, to pay off her overdue bills, maybe even to give the ranch a little breathing room. Still, it felt too sudden, too convenient. Why would Tom recommend me? Because, the colonel said simply, he believed you'd say yes. Sarah looked out at the trucks again, at the soldiers unloading equipment with efficiency. It didn't feel real. One day ago, she'd been preparing to lose everything. Now, military personnel were walking across her land, offering more than she could have hoped for. She crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes slightly. "So you're telling me this is all just coincidence?" The colonel's expression remained unreadable. "Sometimes good deeds come back to you, Miss Miller. Not always, but sometimes." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. She didn't understand all of it. Not yet. But she had the strangest feeling that this wasn't just about a training drill. Something else was at play. Something bigger than she could see from where she stood. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll show you around." The colonel nodded once, then gestured to the others. "Let's walk the property." As they moved toward the barn, Sarah glanced over her shoulder at the long, straight line of military trucks gleaming in the morning light. The same gravel road that had once carried away everything she loved had now brought something else entirely. And though she didn't yet know what it meant, she sensed that the choice she had made in that small-town diner, the choice to give when she had nothing, had just opened a door she never expected to find. As Sarah walked the colonel through her land, a quiet unease began to settle in her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that something about all of this didn't add up. The soldiers moved quickly and with purpose, too purposeful for a casual training exercise. Equipment was being unloaded with practiced precision. Radios were already crackling with coded chatter, and 2 men had even begun inspecting her fence line, making notes and taking measurements. Still, $5,000 was $5,000, and Sarah needed it more than she could admit aloud. So she kept walking, kept answering the colonel's questions, and tried to stay focused. Then he asked to see the barn. Sarah hesitated. It wasn't that she minded. There wasn't anything to hide, but walking into that barn after the night she'd just had felt like walking into a confession. That's where the last of the hay had disappeared. That's where the animals had looked at her with trusting eyes while she gave them barely enough to get through the day. That's where she had nearly cried, alone with her fear and guilt. She pulled the sliding door open, ready to show him the near-empty space. But the moment she stepped inside, she stopped cold. Stacked neatly along the far wall were bales of hay. Dozens of them, more than she had seen in months. Enough to feed all 5 of her remaining horses for weeks. She blinked, thinking her tired eyes were playing tricks on her. "What is this?" she asked, turning to the colonel. He followed her gaze and gave a small, knowing smile. Part of our arrangement. This wasn't in any arrangement, Sarah said, her voice low, uncertain. How did you even know I needed hay? The colonel checked his watch. I believe there's someone who can explain better than I can. Just as he spoke, the sound of tires crunching on gravel reached her ears. A sleek black SUV pulled into the driveway and rolled to a stop. The back door opened, and out stepped a man she barely recognized at first. It was Tom, but not the Tom she'd met in the diner. Slouched, tired, his clothes worn, and his eyes shadowed by worry. This Tom stood straight. He wore a sharp, military-style jacket adorned with insignia she didn't recognize. The limp was still there, but it was barely noticeable now. His entire presence was different, calm, confident, composed. "Hello, Sarah," he said with a smile. She crossed her arms, more bewildered than angry. "You look different today. I owe you an explanation," he said gently. "May we talk inside?" She nodded, leading him and the colonel into the kitchen. She moved on instinct, brewing a fresh pot of coffee while the two men took seats at her worn table. She didn't speak. Not yet. She just waited. Tom opened a folder and slid it across the table toward her. Inside were documents, letters, a logo at the top she didn't recognize, the Mercer Foundation. "I wasn't lying to you," Tom said softly. "I'm a veteran. My family was facing eviction. The baby really was sick. But what I didn't tell you is that I work with the Mercer Foundation." Sarah looked up. "What is it? Some kind of charity?" "Not exactly," Tom said. "It's a private initiative. The foundation helps veterans and families in need, yes. But it also has another mission, one most people never hear about. We look for people who help others. Quietly, selflessly. People who give when they have nothing to gain." She frowned. "You were testing me?" "Observing," he corrected gently. "I never asked you for $1, Sarah. I didn't have to. You saw someone struggling, and you gave without hesitation. That's the kind of heart the foundation looks for." The colonel spoke next. "The military exercises are real. But the decision to use your land was based on Tom's recommendation and what he witnessed. You didn't just help a veteran. You gave away your last hope to someone you barely knew. That doesn't go unnoticed." Sarah sat down slowly, trying to make sense of it all. "So what happens now?" Tom smiled. "Now, we tell you the rest. About what the foundation wants to do here. About what you've made possible." But Sarah didn't need to hear more. Not yet. Her eyes had drifted to the barn outside the kitchen window, where hay now waited for horses who would no longer go hungry. Her mind spun with questions, but one truth sat calmly at the center of it all. Her kindness hadn't vanished into the void. It had been seen, and that changed everything. The kitchen was quiet, save for the soft clink of a coffee spoon against porcelain. Sarah sat at the table, still processing what Tom and the colonel had just revealed. The folder with the Mercer Foundation logo lay open in front of her, but its contents felt almost too surreal to touch. Her world had flipped overnight, and the floor beneath her still felt unsteady. Tom reached into his jacket once more and pulled out a second envelope, thicker than the first. He slid it across the table toward her with the same care she'd shown when she'd placed her last $2,000 between them just the day before. "This isn't a gift," he said. "It's an offer. A real one." Sarah opened the envelope slowly, unfolding the document inside. At first glance, it looked like a standard lease agreement. Legal language, numbered clauses, but then her eyes landed on the words therapeutic riding program. She glanced up, confused. "We've been looking," Tom began, "for a property like yours. Quiet, private, but accessible. A place where we can build something lasting. A center where veterans with PTSD or physical injuries can heal, not just through therapy or medication, but through connection. With animals. With the land." Sarah looked back at the page. Her hands ran slowly over the lines of the contract, her eyes catching phrases like monthly compensation, on-site staff provided, facility construction funded in full. "You'd be leasing just 10 acres, Tom continued. "The foundation would handle everything. Building the barns, installing the equipment, bringing in licensed therapists and trainers. All you need to do is help oversee the horses and the grounds, maybe spend time with some of the vets who come through. You wouldn't lose the ranch. You'd help us give it new purpose." Sarah blinked at the number listed under monthly payments. It wasn't just fair, it was generous. Enough to cover her mortgage, her fee bills, and then some. Enough to give her breathing room. Enough to finally stop surviving and start living again. This is real?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Tom nodded. "Very real. We don't believe in handouts. We believe in partnerships, mutual respect, shared purpose. You showed us who you are, Sarah. When no one was watching, when no cameras were rolling, you chose compassion. That's the kind of person our veterans need to be around. That's who they trust." The colonel leaned forward. "It's not just about horses. It's about hope. About giving these men and women something solid to hold on to when everything else feels broken." Sarah stared at the papers for a long time. She thought of her father's voice again. "The land will test you, but it'll give you purpose if you let it." She thought of the barn, now full of hay. The soldiers fixing her fence line. The mare who'd nuzzled her just that morning, no longer hungry. And she realized something. Maybe this ranch wasn't meant to be saved just for her. Maybe it was meant to serve. She looked up, eyes steady, voice calm. "I need a little time to think. This is a lot." "Of course," Tom said, rising. "We'll be here for 3 days. Take all the time you need. This offer doesn't have an expiration date, just an open door." Sarah followed them out to the porch. The sun was starting to sink low over the fields, casting a warm light across the ranch. Soldiers in the distance were unloading supplies, some chatting, others hammering posts. Her land, the same land she thought she might lose, was alive again. She stood in silence long after the men had walked away, holding the contract in her hands. It wasn't charity. It was an invitation to rebuild, to restore, to make something beautiful from the pieces of what almost was. The sun had begun its slow descent across the Texas sky, painting the fields in gold and shadow. Sarah sat quietly on her front porch, her boots resting on the railing, a cool glass of water sweating in her hand. The contract lay beside her, its corners gently curled in the breeze, as if it, too, was waiting for her decision. Below her, the ranch was alive in a way she hadn't seen in years. 2 soldiers were down near the creek bed, clearing debris that had built up during the dry months. Another was repairing the old gate that had hung crooked since the last storm. Someone else was brushing Belle, her father's mare, who stood calm and content under the touch of a stranger. The air carried the soft sounds of conversation, laughter, the occasional hammer strike against wood. It felt whole. Her eyes swept across the pasture, now dotted with hay bales stacked like small monuments of grace. The horses were fed, the fences mended. The ranch, for the first time in so long, felt like a place of peace. Sarah reached for the contract again, smoothing it out on her lap. Her fingers traced the signature line. A lot had happened in just 2 days. 2 days ago, she was preparing to let it all go, maybe even walk away from the life her father had built with his bare hands. She had stood in her barn, heartbroken, watching her horses chew on the last bits of feed. And then she gave everything she had to a man she barely knew, simply because it felt like the right thing to do. And now, everything was different. But the offer on the table wasn't just about money or land. It was about meaning. It was about choosing to let this place become something more than a fading memory. It was about stepping into something larger than herself. She picked up her phone and stared at the number listed on the front of the folder. Then, without another moment of hesitation, she dialed. A few rings, then a voice, warm, direct, confident. "This is James Mercer." "Mr. Mercer," Sarah said, her voice clear and steady. "This is Sarah Miller." There was a pause. And then, "Miss Miller, I've been hoping I'd hear from you." She looked out across the land, the flag waving gently from the temporary pole the soldiers had raised near the barn. It stood tall against the backdrop of a quiet sky, steadfast like the men and women it represented. "I'd like to accept your offer," she said simply. There was a smile in his voice when he replied. "Tom spoke highly of you, said you gave when you had nothing left to give." Sarah exhaled slowly. She didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to justify her decision. She just looked out at the life stirring across her land and whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, "Sometimes Giving when it's hard is exactly when it matters most. And for the first time in a long, long while, Sarah Miller knew she wasn't just holding on to the past anymore. She was building a future. Sarah's story reminds us that even when we feel like we have nothing left to give, our smallest acts of kindness can carry the greatest weight. Sometimes, the quietest decisions, made in diners, behind dusty fences, with no expectation of recognition, become the spark that ignites something far bigger than we can see. She didn't give because she had extra. She gave because someone needed help more than she did. And in doing so, she didn't just change one life. She opened the door to healing, purpose, and an entirely new future, not only for herself, but for so many others. Now, we want to hear from you. After listening to Sarah's journey, what's one word that comes to your mind? Hope, courage, sacrifice, maybe something else entirely. Drop that word in the comments below. We'd love to know how this story spoke to your heart. And if this tale moved you the way it moved us, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to Mr. Michael Stories for more powerful, real-life stories of resilience, redemption, and the extraordinary impact of everyday choices. Because sometimes one small act of kindness is just the beginning